Welcome to the Fire and Earth podcast with your hosts, Jason Mefford and Kathy Groover. Fire and Earth, giving you the keys to unlock your limitless potential.
Welcome to another edition of the Fire and Earth podcast. I'm one of your co-hosts, Jason Mefford.
And I'm Kathy Groover. And today we're going to talk about feeding your brain. Brain.
That thing that's sticking inside our head as we're moving around every day.
That 2-pound thing that's floating around in there. Yep.
That thing that we use actually very little of.
Yeah. Some of us less than others. I'm just noticing. I mean, not us, not anybody listening, but for those of you that have ever been outside or watched TV or any of that stuff. Yeah, we're not. Our objective here is to help you live up to your full potential. And we have to feed our bodies, we have to feed our soul, we have to nourish all of these aspects of ourselves. And one of the things that's not often talked about is what we're putting into our brain, those thoughts we're having, those things we're letting in, whether it's watching TV or eating bad food. We still have to nourish ourselves. So we're going to talk about nourishing your brain today.
Yeah, so let's, kind of like you said, let's use the analogy, because a lot of times people don't talk about feeding their brain, but it's just as important as, like you said, feeding our soul or feeding our body. And so we can use an analogy like junk food, right? Junk food or even poison, okay? If we put a bunch of junk food into our bodies, then our bodies feel it. We feel sluggish. If you've had a whole bunch of sugar, you end up having this sugar rush and then sugar plummet. People have gone through this, right? Or maybe you've eaten something and you got food poisoning. Right? So your body actually got a little poisoned. And so when it happens to our body, we recognize it. And hopefully we try to do something different or, change that. You got food poisoning, don't eat that thing again, right? Don't go back to that restaurant or, whatever might have happened. But I think a lot of times people don't think about that with our brain. And so I thought about this a lot because I see this, and we put lots of different things into our brain in what we watch, what we listen to, what we see, the conversations that we have. Those are the types of things that are helping to feed our brain. And the good, wholesome things that we put in our brain, the good, wholesome things we're going to get from it, the junk food or the poison that we put in our brain is going to give us that same impact to our brain as it does for our body. And so I'll give you a little story here, because my father-in-law passed away a few months ago. And I haven't watched the news, sat down and watched the news on television for many, many years, because I just a long time ago, realized, most of it's bullshit and they're just trying to scare you. And so I just kind of consciously choose to not really watch the news and realize that if something is important enough for me to know, I'm going to find out from it through some other source. So I haven't watched the news. Now, my father-in-law, again, towards the end of his life, we would go up and see him more often. And he had a ritual. I mean, every night at like 5 o'clock, when the 5 o'clock news started, he would watch the news from 5 to 7, like whatever the time frame is there. And then he'd want to watch it again before he went to bed. And so I would sit there with him in the room and watch the news. And at first, it was kind of like, you have got to be kidding me, right? I mean, I live in the greater LA area. There's 20 plus million people here. And the things that they found to talk about were just crazy. Child brings knife to school in whatever. It's like, really, that's what we have to talk about on the news. There's nothing better to talk about than that. Girl raped in the back of whatever sort of thing. So it's they're bringing in like this very small percentage of everything that's going on. And I could just feel myself almost getting depressed, right? That as all of that is coming into my body, in my mind, that you start to think so skeptically of the world. and you start to think that the world is a horrible place where there's just kids bringing knives to school and people getting raped and murdered and bank robberies and everything else. And you start feeling that, and we have to do a timeout. Hello, right? Stop and think, because that's a very small capsule of what's actually going on in the world. But when we feed ourselves those things, that's what we start seeing. That's what we start thinking about. That's what we start believing. And all of a sudden we can go to a dark place pretty quick.
Yes.
And so it's the equivalent of taking a little bit of poison in with that junk food that you're feeding your brain.
Yeah. So the whole news thing is such a great example. And we see what they want us to see. And so much of it is, spun a very specific way. And I know with what's happening politically right now, people are tied to the TV. And it got to the point where, I would come home, CNN was on, I would watch it, I would get angry, I would get frustrated, I would get irritated. And I found that I was actually starting to get angry in response to what was happening out there somewhere, which is this thing I can't control, which is spun through whichever news network I happen to be watching. Mm-hmm. And I have some clients that literally, they wake up in the morning, they put on the news, it's on all day in the background. This next hurricane is coming through. Da, da, da. That's all they watch all day long. And that is absolutely affecting then how we respond and react to things. And, we talked about all these external things coming into our brain and how that's feeding us. But also remember, we have about 60,000 thoughts a day. 50,000 of those are negative.
It's going to be a negative day.
It's going to be a negative day. But that's just how, our brain is wired to respond to negative things quicker than positive things. That's how we're wired, to protect us. So we are looking for the negative because it keeps us safe. We can plan for it if we know. But unfortunately, we tend to take that to an extreme. And I know a few years back when I was speaking in Jordan, first of all, I'm geographically challenged. So when I got very excited and said to my husband, I said, oh, hey, I'm really excited. My talk to speak in Jordan was accepted. And he goes, oh, that's great. You're not going, right? I went, why am I not going? He said, do you know where Jordan is? I said, no. He goes, you're going to want to look. And so I Googled it and said, oh my crap, it's the Middle East. And, when I announced to people that I was going, and I was also going to go to Egypt, which this was one of the most amazing trips of my life. I was going by myself to the Middle East. People were terrified for me. Oh my God, you're going to get kidnapped. Oh my God, they're going to behead you. Oh, did you hear what happened to the girl? I'm like, what are you talking about? The girl in Syria? It's a whole different country, but in hearing this input of all these people and all this fear of how I was not going to be safe, a couple of things happened. I started to lose my ability to tell what was my own rational mind going, yeah, let's be smart and safe about this. And what, from an empathic standpoint, I was sucking up from all these other people about why I should be so terrified to go. And literally, as I'm pulling into the Jordan airport, I'm looking out the window of the plane expecting to see bombs going off and people running and diving behind bunkers, and because that's what everybody was feeding into my brain. And after so much of that input, I actually started to go, oh crap, maybe I'm making a really bad mistake by coming here. You know what the worst thing that happened was? Nothing bad happened. I didn't miss a flight. I didn't get pickpocketed. I didn't get looked at badly. There was one guy at the airport who didn't speak English, and I got stuck going back out and having to check in again. That happens in the United States, but it's like we hear these things and we start to believe that it's true, and we start to act from this place of things we've heard and not what we actually know to be true. So I think exploring these things and asking questions and doing your own research to feed your brain, not only letting the positive things in and filling ourselves with positivity, but also learning more, because the more knowledge we have, the more power we have. And the more our brain has to access options, then the better off we're going to be. We're not going to get sucked into this negative fast food thought mindset of all this negativity and this scary stuff.
Yeah, and so I think for the listeners that that are on with us now, it's like you said, you got 60,000 thoughts a day. If you're feeling kind of negative, then chances are you're having more negative thoughts than positive thoughts. So, if you start asking yourself some questions, what am I feeding my brain? And if you realize, hey, I'm listening to, talk radio to and from work, and it's just people arguing with each other.
Right.
Well, if you're listening to people arguing for, an hour or 2 hours a day, you think that's going to help or hurt your psyche? Okay. And the same thing with the news, or with maybe certain toxic people that you might be hanging out with, that are also feeding some of those things into your brain. So, if you feel that, you need to kind of do a timeout and say, well, now just a minute, I probably should avoid these things, just like I would avoid the junk food or avoid the poison. And now I've got to start replacing something else. So, you've got to take and change some of those habits. And maybe later we'll talk more about habits as well, but replace some of those bad habits, or those negative routines that you've created, and actually switch them with something that's actually feeding your brain something wholesome. So reading a book, listening to music, listening to a podcast, watching funny videos, cat videos, right? Now they can suck you in, but watching a cat video would be better to your psyche than watching two people argue.
Right. Where they're talking over each other and nothing's getting heard. Yeah, it's the looking at something pretty. It's the England story that I tell in my TEDx talk. It's you can always focus on something negative, look at something pretty. And I remember when I was in, where was I? New Orleans. They have the World War II Museum. And I don't know tons about war. It's not one of my go-to things to investigate or to explore. War movies I'm terrible at, because I feel all that and I just get so upset I can't watch them anymore. But I'm going through the World War II Museum, and I do find old photos fascinating. And because of my medical nerd stuff, if there's things about nursing or things about the medical aspect of war, I just think that's incredible. So I'm walking through this World War II Museum, and it is room after room of imagery of men dying on the field and legs missing. I mean, it was such horrible imagery. And about halfway through, I literally kind of stopped, and I'm tearing up, and I'm like, okay, I can't handle all this input anymore. It was like when you think eating that pound of bacon is going to be a really good idea, and then you get halfway through and you're like, okay, I'm going to puke, or all of the cookies in the package or whatever it is. It seems like so much fun. And then halfway through you realize, oh, this was a bad idea. And halfway through, I literally stopped and I pulled up my phone and I started looking at pretty pictures of animals and babies and like pretty things, because my brain couldn't handle all of this negative input anymore. And if you're familiar at all with Dr. Emoto, Mr. Emoto, and his water experiments, where he would take water crystals and freeze them to see what grew out of these crystals, and he would give this water different input of like love and appreciation, or he'd play classical music, or he'd say Mother Teresa, as opposed to really horrible music and yelling and negative things like I hate you, I want you to die, or Adolf Hitler, these kind of things. And he would then look at what happened with the crystals, and the ones that had this positive input had these beautiful snowflake-like crystals, and the ones that had all this negative input had these horrible misshapen just ugly looking patterns that came out of them. And we're 80% water. So if his research is true, and you can all decide for that, some people think it's total hooey, some people agree with it. It's an interesting theory, because what is our physiology doing from having this negative input, whether it's the raucous loud music, or your neighbors yelling, or you with that self-talk of that self-defeating, self-limited behavior that we're feeding ourselves through ourselves. We're getting enough negative crap out there. Let's at least change the one thing we have the power to do, which is change our thoughts and change our focus. So looking at Emoto's stuff, if that's true, we are actually changing our physiology by thinking positive things, as opposed to thinking all those negative things and letting that negative input in. We have incredible power to do that.
Well, and it is. I mean, change your thinking, change your life, is one of the things that I've heard before. And there has even been some research on, your health improves when you become happier. You don't become happier when your health improves. Right. So it's like this flip around. So you've got to be, putting those good things in your brain first, and then you're going to start to see those effects. But that's why it's so, to me, I've got certain routines that I try to do in the morning, or certain things I try to do every day, to try to help myself feed my brain. Because, we get battered around sometimes during the day at work, and, on the highway if we're driving, and other things like that. So everything we can do to try to protect ourselves, kind of mentally, just like, if we're trying to exercise, that's helping to protect our body physically. Doing some of these things, helps us mentally to be able to make it through the day, so we don't feel so exhausted at the end of the day. And we're able to feed those good thoughts that lead to, other good experiences, help us see the beauty and the pretty things, that are out there in the world, because there's a lot of pretty things. We started talking off about the news and other stuff. Well, for every one of those things that's happening out there that's bad, there's probably a million things that are good. And I deal a lot with, people that are fraud investigators and compliance people, and some people that they have a very negative job. Right? I mean, they're dealing with criminals and other stuff. And sometimes, as I've been messaging with them, they just feel down, like this is a really shitty world. And I'm like, dude, stop, right? You got to put this in perspective. You're dealing with the 1% of the assholes that are in the world. Okay. There are millions and millions of things and people and other stuff that's out there that's beautiful. We just have to go find it.
Yeah.
So take the time to put some of those things into your body, whether that's, engaging in good conversation with people that you love, making friends, reading books, listening to podcasts or other videos that are inspiring. A big one for me is music.
Yeah.
I really love music, and music can totally change your outlook, and you can actually use music to create certain moods as well, depending on what you're trying to do. Read a book, do something that's going to try to improve you and help more of those positive things come into your life, because the more you focus on the positive, the more you're going to get more positive. And so if you're in fear, if you're feeling down and you want to change that, start putting those good, positive thoughts and other things into your mind. Feed your brain the good stuff, and it's going to give you good thoughts.
Data in, data out. Yeah.
Exactly.
We can't put we can't put bad stuff in our car and expect it to run as well. And one of the things I started, because I wanted to watch something at night. That was like my decompressing thing. I'd sit there with a glass of wine and I'd watch, typically CNN, which started to get to me, all the negativity and the yelling, like you said, people talking over each other. And so what I started doing is I'd turn off the TV, I would go to YouTube, and I started watching old episodes of Whose Line Is It Anyway? Which
a great show.
One is hilarious. Two, I grew up doing improv, so it helps me with my skills as a speaker, as someone who teaches improv to corporations and stuff like that, as team building and as communication skills. I would sit there and watch Whose Line Is It Anyway, and I would laugh my ass off because these guys are awesome. And then I'd put on the bloopers from Whose Line Is It Anyway,
which are even better.
Because they're bleeped out, because especially Ryan Stiles gets a little but no, it's like, but that was what I did. And I would go to bed, happy and having laughed for the last 45 minutes, as opposed to stupid guy CNN, as opposed to this negative thing. Is the last thing you want to think about before you go to bed. That half hour before we go to sleep, everything goes straight into our subconscious. If you're going to do your affirmations, if you're going to watch something funny, if you're going to do that right before you go to sleep, because it goes straight into our subconscious and allows us to make changes. So one of the best things we can do for our brain is affirmations right before we go to bed. Write them out in cursive. Remember longhand that you and I learned. They don't even teach anymore. But write that down, put that in your brain, go to sleep, wake up feeling fabulous. Wake up feeling fabulous.
Because I think that's a good point. What you do right before you go to bed and what we do when we first wake up are some of the most important times in our day. And so especially during those times when we usually control it. Yeah. We usually get to control when we go to bed and when we get up. So, take that time to actually fill that space with as much good as you can. because like you said, it goes into your subconscious, and that has a huge impact. One that we don't consciously understand. Bad pun.
It was okay.
Yeah, okay.
We won't dock your pay or anything.
Okay, all right.
Cool. Well, that sounds like what we do before we go to bed. That's a fabulous place to end. So, just to do a quick recap, the same way we need to put amazing things in our body to nourish our cells, we have to do the same thing with our brain. Yes, eating right actually is part of that, but also those things that we allow in, those thoughts, that input from others, that input from TV, and our own thoughts. We have to make sure those are as positive and happy as possible. And right before we go to bed, write some affirmations. Change things while you sleep. Change and nourish your brain while you're getting rest. So I think that's a good place to end.
It's a great place to end. And as you do that, you will be unlocking your potential, and you'll actually feel better too.
Yes.
You won't feel as tired. You won't feel as drug out. You'll see the world in a positive light, and you'll see all of those pretty and beautiful things that are out there in the world. Which leads to more gratitude, which leads to more seeing those things. And it becomes this nice causal loop of just making you feel happy, and realizing that we're all pretty damn lucky in this world to be alive. So go out there and do that, feed your brain, and make today and this week the best that you can.
Yes. I am your host, Kathy Groover. More information can be found about me at kathygroover.com.
And I'm Jason Mefford. I can be reached at jasonmefford.com.
See you next time on another episode of the Fire and Earth Podcast.